Welcome to episode 3 of the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast. My name is Mary and I'm your host, and I am so glad you're here. If this is your first time listening, I have a blog, therosehomestead.com, where I share a ton of recipes, mostly sourdough, and a lot of posts about sourdough tricks and tips and just different things like that. I also have a YouTube channel, Rose Homestead, and I share kind of the more visual side of sourdough. And on this podcast, I dive deep into questions that I get about sourdough. So today we are going to talk about a big question that I get when it comes to sourdough, and that is, how long is it before I can bake a loaf of bread with my sourdough starter? Now, this is kind of a loaded question because there's no specific time that I can give somebody. But what I can do is tell you what you can do so that you will be able to bake bread sooner than later. What you're needing to do is develop your sourdough starter so it will leaven a big lump of dough and make bread that's fluffy and delicious. And it takes some time. It takes a lot of patience. But we're going to dive into what you can do to make your sourdough starter more active, more mature, more quickly. So let's just start at the beginning. You made a sourdough starter. It took 5, sometimes up to 12 days, but you made a sourdough starter. It's active, it's bubbly, and you know you're on the right track, but you keep trying to make bread and nothing happens. Well, it's really boils down to how much yeast is in that sourdough starter. Even though it's active and the yeast has activated and the lactic acid bacteria has activated, over time that grows. And so what happens is, say a half a cup of starter that's 12 days old could take like forever to raise a loaf of bread. I hate to say that. That sounds awful, but it could take a very, very long time. Whereas a half a cup of a 10-year-old sourdough starter can raise a loaf of bread in 4 hours. And so what you're trying to do is build a mature starter that can leaven your bread a little more quickly. And the way that you do that is to use it and keep feeding it as much as possible. And that's where all of these sourdough discard recipes come in handy. I know you see these, and it's so, it's really not accurate to say discard. For me anyway, I don't discard sourdough starter. To me, sourdough discard really just means inactive or hungry starter that's not in what we call the active phase of the starter. And so there are so many recipes. I'm actually making one today as I'm recording this. I'm as soon as I'm finished recording, I'm going to make a sourdough pumpkin muffin recipe that can use sourdough discard. And it's really about making recipes, and it's really about feeding it in between. Now, the more recipes you can make and the more often you can feed your starter, the faster that your starter is going to be mature enough to bake a loaf of bread. So let's talk about sourdough discard recipes. Why do you want a bunch of these recipes? I have several on my website, and they are so handy. Let's just say for somebody like me that has an active, very mature starter, why would I want sourdough discard recipes? Well, because sometimes I feed my starter because I think I'm going to make something for the blog, like a recipe, and then something unexpected happens in my life and I don't get to make that recipe, and I have this starter and it's active, and then by the time I get back to that starter, it is very inactive and it's got a lot of hooch or liquid on top. It smells really strong, like nail polish remover. And I know that at that point, although I can make bread with that, it will rise. It's really just better for me to make a quick recipe and feed that starter and get it a little more active before I start a bread recipe. And so there are many times that happens to me. And when that happens, I always go for my sourdough discard recipes. So the reason we call them sourdough discard recipes is because you don't require a big rise out of these recipes. You still let them ferment and you still get the fermentation benefits of the sourdough starter, but you don't require a big rise. And also, if you're not concerned about the fermentation benefits, these can be no wait recipes. You can make, like the muffins I'm making today, you don't have to let them ferment overnight. You can make them quick. And those types of recipes are really nice. And what happens is in a recipe where you make it quick, the sourdough starter adds flavor. It's not really for the long fermentation benefits, but it does add flavor to the recipe. So that's why that I tell people, even if you're not going to let it ferment overnight and you have a brand new starter, make these recipes, just add some sourdough starter to your recipes so that you can continue to feed it as often as possible. Even in your yeast bread recipes, add some sourdough starter. You'll get the flavor and you'll use up your starter and be able to feed it more often. So how long generally will it take? Here's what has been a good measure for me. I've made a lot of sourdough starters just because it's like a hobby that I have with different flours and different things like that, different techniques. And my measurement for how long it takes to get a sourdough starter ready to make a loaf of bread is this. If I use that sourdough starter at least 2 to 3 times a week and I feed it at least 2 to 3 times a week, then in about 3 weeks, I can make a loaf of bread. But I do want to make a point that in my kitchen, I have something fermenting all the time. And so there's all of this wild yeasts in the air. And it's hard to explain, but if you've never made something fermented in your kitchen, it takes longer to ferment something because as you ferment and ferment and ferment and ferment in your kitchen, there's like this colony of, and don't quote me on that. I'm not a scientist or technical person. I'm just saying it seems like that whatever you're fermenting feeds off of what's in the air, because I have learned that my sourdough ferments so much quicker after I started fermenting other things in my kitchen. And so I hope that makes sense. So let's say you do milk kefir and you do fermented vegetables and you do kombucha and you do sauerkraut and you do sourdough, your bread will rise faster. And there has to be some scientific reason for that, because I have noticed this so much since I started fermenting other things. But let's just say that you're a person who your sourdough starter is the only thing that's ever fermented on your counter. How long is it going to take? It could take a month for your sourdough starter to get strong enough. And I think sometimes there's a misconception that when I say, oh, it could take up to a month to get it strong enough, that means sitting in the fridge for a month. No, that's using it at least 2 to 3 times a week and then feeding it again. And that builds a starter up over a month so that you can bake bread. And at that point, my advice is to always make sandwich loaf first. The reason is when you make a sandwich loaf, you can see it rise. It's a little easier to gauge the time that it's going to take for it to rise. You know, when you're making artisan bread, those beautiful round loaves of bread that we all want to make when we make a sourdough starter, it takes time to learn when that dough is ready to shape, and then when is it ready to bake. And making all these other recipes really teaches you a lot about sourdough. It teaches you how strong your sourdough starter is over time, and how long does it take to rise a loaf of bread? How long does it take to rise dinner rolls? And it really helps you to learn and get you ready for that beautiful artisan loaf of bread. Now, I do know people who can make an artisan loaf of bread right away, like their starter's a couple of weeks old. They make this gorgeous loaf of artisan bread, and that has not been the case for me as a sourdough baker. And so I suggest that you wait a month, and then the first thing you make is a sandwich loaf instead of an artisan loaf. I hope that makes sense. So getting back to sourdough discard recipes, you don't really have to have a recipe to use sourdough starter in a regular recipe. What I always say is half a cup of sourdough starter is equal to roughly, now I'm saying roughly, a quarter cup of flour and a quarter cup of water. That's a rough estimate. So let's just say that you're making muffins and you want to add a half a cup of your sourdough starter to that to use it up so that you can feed it. Then you want to take about a quarter cup of flour and a quarter cup of liquid out of that recipe, and that will make up for adding the sourdough starter. And I hope that helps, because I never really had a lot of sourdough discard recipes when I was early on with my sourdough starter, and I would just add it in and it still worked fine. I didn't adjust anything and it still worked fine. I was just trying to use it and get it strong, and it worked really, really well. And so I feel like that's probably the best starting point, is just throw it in recipes and you'll notice flavor added to your recipes. I think that it does have a little bit of an effect on texture, especially if you're putting it in your yeast bread recipes or your muffin recipes. But yeah, just add it into your recipes. You don't have to have a specific recipe. But if you're a person who likes to follow recipes, I do have a ton of sourdough recipes, discard recipes over on my blog. So that's something that you can look at. Let's look at another side of the active sourdough starter, and let's talk about the flour that you're feeding it and how that can affect it too. I get a lot of people who say, do you use rye in your sourdough starter? Because a lot of people do. And I said this on an earlier podcast, but I have used rye, and the sourdough starters seem to really love it. And so it is possible that if you feed your sourdough starter rye, that it will be active sooner, so that you can bake with it sooner than later. And so that's just a little tip with the flours. I use all different flours. I use rye, whole grain flour, freshly milled flour, all-purpose flour, whole wheat flour from the store. I've used all kinds of different ones. And lately I just use what I have. So if I have some extra freshly milled flour, I'll throw it in there and feed my starter that. If I don't have any milled and I need to feed it, I will throw some all-purpose flour in there. But it really, after it's really active, it doesn't matter. And it really doesn't matter in the beginning either. But if you're wanting to get it active quicker, I would try the rye flour. I think that there's something to that, because I have used it and it does seem to really like it. So let's just kind of recap here. You made a sourdough starter. You're not sure when you can bake bread with it, or you've tried to bake bread and it just isn't rising. My advice is to use your sourdough starter in everything. I know that sounds so crazy, but whatever you're baking, throw a half cup sourdough starter in it. If you're baking, even if you're making your yeast breads, throw sourdough starter in it. Pancakes, throw sourdough starter. You can actually take a cup of sourdough starter. This recipe's over on my blog. If you go to therosehomestead.com and search for sourdough pancakes, it's so easy. It's a cup of sourdough starter, an egg, some baking soda, salt, maybe some olive oil, and that's it. You can make pancakes, and that uses a lot of sourdough starter. You can make pizza crusts out of it. I found that for the first time on the Farmhouse on Boone channel. She just pours sourdough starter in a hot skillet and makes a pizza, and it works really well. There's so many things you can do with sourdough starter. You don't have to even add flour. You can make a fry bread, which is just sourdough starter with some herbs, some olive oil, salt. And I mean, there's so many things that you can do with it. But the point is to use it as much as possible so that you can feed it and build up that good bacteria in the yeast. So I hope that this was helpful for you if that was one of your big questions when it comes to sourdough starter, and that you will just start using that sourdough starter and enjoy those recipes that you're using your sourdough in before you get to make a loaf of bread solely with sourdough starter, because those recipes you will keep making. I promise. They are so good. They are easy. They're no weight recipes, and it's just really comes in handy when you have a big jar of sourdough starter and you need something to do with it. So if you have any questions that you would like for me to cover on this podcast, please leave me a comment and I will put that on the list. I can be here for days and days answering questions, and I love it. I love talking about sourdough. In next week's episode, I am going to dive into the world of freshly milled flour and sourdough, which is a big topic that I love to talk about because I love to use freshly milled flour in my sourdough. So if you have any questions specifically about that, please leave them in the comment section of this episode and I will get to them on the next episode. Well, thank you all so much for joining me on this third episode of the Sourdough Can Be Simple podcast. And I hope y'all are doing well, and we will talk to you all next week. Have a great one.